So Trump, of course, has proclaimed that the war ends as well with the ceasefire, but I don't think it's going to be as easy as that. We need to see what happens to the nuclear negotiations that have been ongoing between the US and Iran, but have been stuck very much on a very critical sticking point as to whether Iran is to be allowed to enrich any uranium or not.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has confirmed a ceasefire with Iran after a series of attacks on each other's territory that left hundreds dead and even got the U.S. involved. A tentative calm has returned to the region for now. That's good news for energy markets, which not only rely on several countries in the Persian Gulf for fossil fuels, but also for the waterways to ship it. For more, we speak to Vandana Hari, founder of the energy intelligence firm Vanda Insights. Thank you for joining us this morning. It's been a tumultuous last few days, but we seem to be at a ceasefire now. Has it also been a roller coaster on the energy markets?
Good morning, Cassandra. So indeed, quite a roller coaster. We saw a lot of volatility in crude on occasions, especially the first few days after the Israeli strikes on Iran began. We saw crude within a single session oscillating up to $8, between $70, $78 for Brent. So a lot of volatility, as you were alluding to earlier, a lot of speculation over some of the worst case scenarios, especially a lot of attention centered around what might Iran do with regard to the Strait of Hormuz. We know that Iran, through history, has periodically threatened to close that very vital artery for oil. Thankfully, that didn't happen. But again, I think it's a sort of uneasy calm in the markets, I would say. Even if there is indeed a proper firm ceasefire, we know, again, ceasefires do get occasionally violated, unfortunately. So I think there'll be a bit of a wait and watch in the market before crude surrenders the remaining fear premium.
You mentioned the Strait of Hormuz, a historically important passageway for fossil fuels, but I'm wondering, is it still as significant a choke point as it has been, or has there been, for example, an increase in pipelines that might have made it less significant as a pathway?
Yeah, that's interesting, right? The world has known about its vulnerability with regard to that strait for many, many years, a few decades now at least. But it's this is the story with major oil and gas infrastructure. It's really very hard to find workarounds. If it's about ships sailing routes, like what we saw in the Red Sea, for instance, the Houthis began attacking ships there and ships started going via the Cape of Good Hope. That's easier. But some of these choke points, and that's why they are called that, for a very good reason, and very critical waterway, that's another phrase used for the Strait of Hormuz, is because there are very few realistic alternatives that could be put in place within a specified period of time. So no, there aren't really any alternatives. The vast majority of the production from those countries are Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Iraq, Kuwait, Oman, some from Qatar as well. All the LNG from Qatar has to go via that strait.
In your viewpoint, was Iran ever going to cut off the Strait of Hormuz? It seems like it would have been a self-imposed wound as well.
Absolutely. It would have been shooting itself in the foot, which was one of the reasons that we at Vanda Insights assigned it a very, very small tail risk in sort of all probability, negligible probability of that happening, because there was very real tactical hurdles. So we know that U.S. has beefed up its naval presence. Of course, it has a lot of ground presence, Air Force presence in the region as well. So that acted as a deterrent. It would have also served as a quick response force to stop Iran, because that's a very physical activity, right? It's easy to see where Iranian forces are coming from that try to blockade it. I think there was also very strategic hurdles in terms of, Iran would not risk turning its neighboring oil and gas producing countries and exporting countries into enemies. Essentially, that's what it would be doing by trying to block the strait, because it would block their flows of their oil to the world markets as well. And of course, angering its key market and supporter, China. Right? So it's not just Iranian oil that China gets through that strait, but all the Middle Eastern oil as well. And we know that Asia is the main consumer of all of the oil that comes through the Persian Gulf. So for a variety of reasons, Iran would have had almost nothing to gain and a lot to lose by even trying to blockade it.
You mentioned China, of course, a major buyer of Iranian oil, approximately 1.8 million barrels per day. At least that's some of the more recent figures. China and Russia had also called for a ceasefire, but what role did China play in this?
Yes, so slightly different roles, though they are both assumed to be on Iran's side and to have Iran's ears, basically. But I think with regard to Russia, it was more a speculation in the markets that would Putin come to the aid of Iran should the fighting continue, with more firepower and so on. And it became pretty clear sort of midway through that 12-day conflict that was not going to be the case. I think that was probably a bit of a relief for markets, because the last thing we needed was for this war or the conflict, which started out as Israel versus Iran, to sort of broaden and pull in Russia, which is already tied up quite a bit in Ukraine as well. With regards to Iran, with regards to China, I think politically it plays its cards very differently from Russia. And I think I would imagine that there was much more going on behind the scenes, not in terms of military support. I don't think that's where China would come in, but in terms of persuading or prevailing on the powers that be in Tehran to not take a reckless step of trying to blockade the Strait of Hormuz. So we may never know whether, how that conversation went, but I would imagine that China, especially having been requested by the US, we know that happened, to lean on Tehran not to do that, would have very well, I imagine, conveyed that message on its own behalf, basically.
Stepping back, Iran is an original member of OPEC. Do we expect any changes to production from this group of oil-producing countries in light of this recent conflict?
So an ongoing story with OPEC Plus has been the 8 members that had implemented 2.2 million barrels per day of cuts on a sort of voluntary basis, coming on top of all the other cuts that have been across the wider group before 2024. These are being unwound, and a few months ago, they decided to accelerate the unwinding, which was quite counterintuitive for a lot of market participants. I believe that has more to do with the internal dynamics within OPEC rather than the external market conditions or the physical demand for oil. So OPEC Plus is, I think, struggling a little bit with maintaining internal cohesion in the face of some members not adhering to their quotas, especially Kazakhstan, which has a field, the Tengiz field, which is pumping way more now with an upgrade project. And it said it's just not in a position to rein in its output. So I believe it's being done more to preserve that internal solidarity, and I expect them to stay put on that path. So continue accelerating, putting about 411,000 barrels per day back in the market additionally every month.
I want to turn to the U.S. briefly. That country's main central banker, Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, will be grilled by lawmakers on Tuesday. It's a planned semi-annual appearance, but he's expected to get some pressure. Why is that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think partly that could also come from the Republicans, who are essentially echoing what President Trump has been saying. I would say pretty much shouting from the rooftops, asking, or rather demanding of Powell that he cut rates immediately, cut them by substantially. I think Trump last demanded he cut them by at least 100 basis points, which is quite a tall ask. And Powell seems to have been not paying heed at all. So I do expect that he will face quite a bit of heat from Republicans demanding to know why the Fed is continuing to hold its rate steady, especially when we see that the ECB has been going in completely the opposite direction. If the Fed thinks that there is that the job market is doing quite well, and inflation based on the data that has been coming out in recent months seems to be all right, not too hot, then why is the Fed resisting cutting rates? So I think he'll have some very tough questions to answer. Ultimately, Cassandra, it ties into the market's confidence with regard to how the US economy is able to weather this tariff storm. So a lot of people out there, economists as well, believe that if the Fed cuts the rates a little bit more, it might get easier for Americans and for the American economy to do a little bit better, to fight off the headwinds that are coming its way. So let's see how that pans out. That could be, it'll give clues to the market participants, certainly, on how Powell is thinking with regard to the next, when the next cuts might happen. I think the market is pricing in at least 2 cuts later this year, but what the timing of that might be, I think that could affect overall sentiment in the broader financial markets.
I do want to talk about how you're seeing these headwinds that are coming downwind or upwind, but connect the dots for folks. How does this conflict that seems to be being discussed in the United States about whether or not to raise, or I guess just lower rates, how does that connect to energy markets?
So it connects sort of in a circuitous route. How the US economy performs is dependent, of course, on a lot of macroeconomic factors, right? So how the job market does, how inflation pans out, especially in the coming months. I think there's far more attention on that rather than looking sort of in the rearview mirror with regard to how inflation was in the first 4 or 5 months of the year. How the Fed manages interest rates. And we see that that also then ties into interest rates in the bond markets. So basically, what sort of interest is the corporate America and individuals with regard to their student loans or mortgages paying, because all of that is essentially a burden. Higher interest rate is a burden on the consumer. It's a burden on corporate America. So that is a key input when it comes to market participants building their outlook for the US economy, especially in a year of this huge tariffs turmoil. So I would say, lower interest rates is something that is, or just as a knee-jerk reaction, will give much more calm and reassurance to the markets that the US consumer and the corporate America could weather the storm.
And of course, you mentioned tariffs, and this conflict, for now a ceasefire between Iran and Israel. There's a lot of geopolitical tensions throughout the world and other economic tensions as well. Looking ahead, what are you going to be keeping your eyes on in the days and weeks to come?
So once the dust settles on this immediate outbreak of the current past 12 days' outbreak of hostilities between Iran and Israel, I think the oil market will maintain a nervous watch on, does the war end? So Trump, of course, has proclaimed that the war ends as well with the ceasefire, but I don't think it's going to be as easy as that. For real peace between Israel and Iran, for real rapprochement between the US and Iran, I think a lot of other pieces need to fall in place. We need to see what happens to the nuclear negotiations that have been ongoing between the US and Iran, but have been stuck very much on a very critical sticking point as to whether Iran is to be allowed to enrich any uranium or not. I think so. This will be some of the key elements that the oil market will continue to watch. But as long as some sort of calm returns on that end, I do expect all the macroeconomic sentiment to rotate back to the center stage. I expect that to happen in the coming days. So again, attention goes back to the tariffs, the tariff deals. There's a July 8th or 9th deadline for the US to sign these agreements with all the countries other than China. A month later, it's the deadline for the US and China to sign a trade deal if they're to avoid punitive high import tariffs against each other. So I would expect that sort of broader economic picture more skewed towards economic concerns and headwinds to come back to the center stage with regard to the oil sentiment, while at the same time on the supply side of oil, I think the market is quite reassured that there's going to be adequate, possibly oversupply of oil. So all of that builds up to basically sort of a dim outlook when it comes to prices. We should, geopolitical flashpoints aside, we should probably see some calming in oil prices again, back into perhaps the mid to high 60s for Brent.
Vandana Hari of Vanda Insights, thank you for joining us.